January 1942, the North Atlantic churned beneath a sky heavy with slate-gray clouds. Waves crashed against the hulls of Allied convoys, their wooden decks slick with salt and fear. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen eyes tracked their every move. Waiting for the telltale shimmer of a torpedo's wake, sailors huddled in the cold, clutching lifelines. The creak of metal and the groan of engines their only companions in the endless night. Yet the real danger was invisible, not the storm, not even the U-boats patrolling the shipping lanes, but a whisper of a weapon that promised to defy conventional wisdom. Generals and admirals had dismissed it as impossible. A naval engineer in a small, cluttered lab in the United States, fueled by coffee, ambition, and the knowledge that every convoy lost meant lives cut short, was about to prove them wrong in a world where every ship carried soldiers, supplies, and hope. One man's invention would turn the oceans into a minefield of nightmares. The first strike was coming, and no one would see it until it was already too late. The Atlantic waited, so did the engineer. The stage is set for ingenuity to meet the horrors of war, and history to pivot in silence. By 1939, the world was already in flames. Europe had erupted into another devastating conflict, and the Atlantic Ocean had become a lifeline and a battlefield. For the Allies, the ocean was not just water. It was a fragile thread connecting Britain to the United States, Canada, and the colonies. Every convoy carried soldiers, ammunition, food, and hope. But every convoy also faced annihilation from the silent predators lurking beneath the waves. German U-boats, sleek and merciless, patrolled the shipping lanes with deadly precision. The early months of the war revealed the Allies' vulnerability. Convoys were being picked apart, sometimes with catastrophic efficiency. Merchant ships, slow and lightly armed, were easy prey for the technologically advanced submarines of the Kriegsmarine. By the end of 1940, Britain had lost nearly 1,500 merchant ships in the Atlantic alone. Each sinking was not just a number. It was food denied to civilians, weapons withheld from soldiers, and lives extinguished before their time. The U-boat threat forced the Allies into desperate measures. Convoy formations tightened, escort vessels increased, sonar technology was pushed to its limits, and aircraft patrols scoured the horizon. Yet the ocean remained vast, and the Wolf packs moved with terrifying freedom. Even the most sophisticated destroyers struggled to detect a submarine until it was already firing tactical innovations, while improving survival odds were reactive, never proactive. For every new countermeasure, the Germans adapted with almost uncanny speed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched from a distance, officially neutral but increasingly aware that the fate of the Allies could determine its own. Naval intelligence tracked every report of convoy losses, every encounter with U-boats. Yet the U.S. Navy faced its own limitations. The battleships and aircraft carriers were formidable on paper, but they were designed for large fleet engagements, not the quiet, predatory war waged beneath the waves. Standard torpedoes were unreliable, depth charges often ineffective, and new technology came slowly through bureaucracy and skepticism. In this environment of urgency and doubt, engineers in the U.S. were given a singular, almost impossible mission: to conceive a weapon that could change the rules of naval warfare. They were not generals or admirals. They were men in labs and workshops, drafting blueprints, building prototypes, and testing theories. Every idea that left the lab had to survive not only scientific scrutiny, but also the cynicism of commanders who had seen too many miracle weapons fail. Some dismissed the concept outright. "It's impossible," said a senior officer reviewing early proposals. No man could design a device that would strike ships undetectably, safely, and reliably. But others saw a glimmer of hope. War was evolving, and survival demanded innovation. In cramped rooms filled with blueprints, chalkboards, and the hum of electric motors, U.S. engineers began to imagine something radical: a weapon that could drift silently across the ocean, strike without warning, and wreak havoc on enemy fleets by late 1941. Preliminary tests had begun. Early experiments were messy. Prototypes sank too quickly, detonators failed. And skeptics grew louder, but persistence became the engineer's ally. In every failure lay data. In every setback, the outline of a solution outside the lab. The war intensified. German submarines continued their ruthless campaign. And every convoy sunk reinforced the urgency of innovation. The Atlantic was a vast, indifferent theater. But soon it would host a new kind of battle, one fought as much with ingenuity and physics as with guns and armor. As the U.S. prepared to enter the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The stage was set. The oceans, long considered the domain of brute force and massed fleets, were about to witness an unprecedented form of warfare. One man's determination in a quiet lab, far from the roar of combat, would intersect with history in a way that no strategist could have predicted. Engineers' work was still confined to sketches and test tanks. But the shadows of possibility stretched far across the Atlantic soon. Every sailor, every ship, every convoy would encounter a danger that had been deemed impossible, until now, while the Atlantic convulsed with war. The real battle was quietly unfolding thousands of miles away. In U.S. naval laboratories and engineering workshops, these were places of both brilliance and frustration. Where ambition collided with skepticism, the United States Navy, acutely aware of the losses inflicted by German U-boats, had begun to funnel resources into technological innovation, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and the concept of a ship-killing device that could operate unseen was met with doubt. In a small lab on the outskirts of a coastal city, a team of engineers and physicists worked under strict secrecy. Their leader, the engineer whose ingenuity would eventually rewrite naval strategy, was a methodical man, obsessed with precision, experimentation, and the belief that the impossible could be achieved. He was not alone in his doubts or struggles. Colleagues argued over design specifications. Detonators malfunctioned and prototypes failed repeatedly. Yet in these failures, critical lessons emerged. Each sinking, each misfire, each miscalculated test provided data to refine the next iteration. The U.S. military establishment, initially skeptical, began to take notice. Reports of test successes, small but promising, trickled up the chain of command. Admirals, long conditioned to think in terms of battleships and fleet engagements, were now forced to consider an entirely new form of warfare, one in which stealth, timing, and ingenuity mattered as much as firepower. It was an unsettling prospect. Some officers questioned whether a weapon that operated invisibly could be trusted or controlled. Others realized that it might be the only chance to tip the scales. In the Atlantic, the development process was painstaking. Engineers grappled with the limits of contemporary technology, explosives that could survive months at sea, mechanisms that could activate under precise conditions, and delivery systems that remained undetectable to enemy sonar. Every component had to function flawlessly. A single miscalculation could render the weapon useless or, worse, catastrophic to friendly forces. Testing was both rigorous and secretive. Early trials took place in isolated bays. Often under the cover of darkness, observers noted the smallest anomalies, a delay in detonation, a drift off course, and the data fed directly into iterative design improvements. Meanwhile, news from the front continued to underscore the urgency of their work. Convoys were still being attacked, supply lines severed, and morale strained. Reports detailed ships torpedoed within hours, entire crews lost to the cold Atlantic. Every sinking reinforced the stakes. The engineer and his team were acutely aware that their work was not abstract. It had the power to save lives, or fail disastrously. The tension between scientific precision and wartime necessity pressed on them like the weight of the ocean itself. By mid-1942, the weapon began to take a recognizable form. The engineer's calculations, combined with relentless trial and error, produced a device capable of drifting silently through water, activating upon proximity to a ship, and delivering devastating force with no visible warning. Admirals who had once dismissed the project as fantasy were now cautiously intrigued. The question shifted from "could it work?" to "how soon can it be deployed?" At the same time, intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had no concept of what was coming. German and Japanese naval strategists remained focused on conventional threats, submarines, aircraft, and artillery. They had not anticipated a weapon designed to strike invisibly, to turn the very sea into a trap. This gap between innovation and expectation created an opportunity the Allies could exploit, but only if the weapon could survive testing, production, and the first deployment. The engineer's lab became a crucible of ingenuity, discipline, and human endurance. Long nights, endless calculations, and the constant threat of failure shaped not only the device, but the man himself. In these quiet halls, away from the battles raging across oceans and continents, history was being written one experiment at a time. Every success pushed closer to the impossible becoming reality. Every setback strengthened the resolve to persevere. The stage was set soon. The Atlantic, already a theater of immense peril, would host a weapon that no sailor could see coming. Yet none could ignore what had begun, as sketches on a drafting table was approaching operational reality, and with that, the world was about to witness the intersection of human genius and wartime necessity in a way that would leave no convoy untouched. In a small, cluttered laboratory, surrounded by blueprints, oscilloscopes, and the faint smell of gunpowder, one man carried the weight of an ocean on his shoulders. He was not a general, nor a celebrated war hero. He was an engineer, meticulous, determined, and quietly defiant of conventional wisdom. His colleagues spoke of his obsession with precision, how he could spend hours recalculating the trajectory of a simple mechanism, adjusting detonators by fractions of an inch, and testing models until even the tiniest flaw was corrected. Yet human determination alone was not enough. The engineer faced relentless skepticism from both peers and superiors early. Proposals were dismissed as fantasy. Admirals argued that no device could reliably strike unseen, and some questioned the morality of such a weapon. But for him, it was never about recognition. It was about survival. Every convoy lost meant lives extinguished before their time, families shattered, and morale crushed. This sense of responsibility became a quiet, driving force, a reminder that the impossible had real-world consequences. And the solution rested on human ingenuity. His personal life reflected the intensity of his work. Letters to family were brief and infrequent. Sleep was measured in hours, often sacrificed to ensure calculations were double-checked. Experiments meticulously recorded. His team, initially doubtful, came to respect this tireless dedication. Each prototype failure became a lesson. Each small success, a step toward transforming fear and skepticism into tangible, operational reality. The device itself was a marvel of engineering, deceptively simple in appearance, yet fiendishly complex in execution. It needed to survive weeks in unpredictable sea conditions, remain undetectable, and activate with perfect timing. The engineering challenges were immense. Explosives had to remain stable in salt water. Mechanisms had to function despite temperature shifts and pressure changes. And the delivery system had to ensure it reached its target without deviation. Innovations were born from necessity. Engineers experimented with magnetically triggered detonators, buoyancy control, and corrosion-resistant materials. Every design decision was grounded in physics and oceanography, how a current might carry the device, how a ship's hull interacted with its magnetic field, even how the temperature of the water affected the explosives. All these factors were painstakingly calculated. Testing was relentless. Early prototypes sank too quickly, misfired, or failed to activate. Each failure, however, provided critical data. Refining calculations and guiding the next iteration, the result was a device that combined simplicity and sophistication, a weapon that operated on principles both invisible and unavoidable. It was engineering poetry. A fusion of science, innovation, and practical necessity. Naval warfare until this point relied on visible threats, artillery barrages, torpedo attacks, airstrikes. Convoys could anticipate danger, maneuver to avoid attacks, and coordinate defenses. The introduction of this weapon fundamentally shifted the calculus. Now, danger could arrive silently, without warning, and strike from beneath the waves. Convoy tactics had to evolve, escort strategies reconsidered, and naval doctrine rewritten to account for the invisible enemy. Commanders realized that traditional methods, destroyer screens, sonar patrols, air reconnaissance, were no longer sufficient on their own. The ocean itself had become part of the battlefield, transformed into a zone where physics and ingenuity dictated outcomes more than sheer firepower. In operational planning rooms, naval officers debated deployment strategies, weighing risk against potential impact. The weapon's ability to deny safe passage transformed logistical considerations, forcing the Allies to rethink how they transported men, material, and hope across contested waters from the enemy decks. Nothing looked different. Smoke curled from stacks, lookouts scanned the horizon. Sonar operators listened for the familiar cough of a submarine. The sea was the same indifferent blue, yet ships began to sink with a new kind of quiet. Survivors spoke of sudden ruptures below the waterline. No wake, no torpedo track. No time to call out the order to abandon ship for commanders of the Kriegsmarine and, in other theaters, the Imperial Japanese Navy. The pattern was alarming at first. Naval intelligence searched for familiar culprits. Were submarines operating in new, stealthier ways? Had aircraft improved covert attack methods? The lack of physical evidence puzzled analysts. Technical reports filed after hearings confessed uncertainty. Hulls split with no explanatory marks. Crews clambered into lifeboats stunned but alive. And no conventional attacker claimed responsibility in the absence of answers. Fear grew. Rumors circulated about new Allied torpedoes, underwater mines laid by stealthy vessels, or even sabotage from within neutral ports. When the truth edged into their briefings, it landed like cold iron, a weapon that activated under a ship's hull, undetectable until detonation, changed the enemy's risk calculus. Defensive doctrine, which had relied on visible signs and predictable attack vectors, now faced an unknown ship. Captains began to question whether any passage, even through supposedly safe channels, could be trusted. Convoy timing, once a tactical puzzle of escorts and evasive maneuvers, had to account for a threat that ignored standard countermeasures. The enemy response evolved painfully. Mine-sweeping techniques were revised. Hull inspections intensified. The German and Japanese navies scrambled to develop countermeasures, magnetic degaussing, altered routes, greater distance from known hazards. But innovation takes time. Each adjustment cost effort, resources, and lives. In the meantime, the psychological impact was profound. The sea, formerly a stage of rules, became a place of paranoia. Sailors developed new habits of vigilance. Commanders wrestled with uncertainty. The Allies had introduced not only a weapon, but a form of doubt into the enemy mind, and doubt, in war, is a weapon of its own from the admiral's perspective. The arrival of such a weapon was both opportunity and administrative quagmire. Naval leaders had to weigh intelligence, verify tests, and then decide whether to trust their lives and supply lines to a device developed far from battlefields. Institutional conservatism resisted rapid adoption. Naval doctrine is built on predictability. Training cycles and ship modifications require time and budget. Endorsing a radical new weapon meant cutting through layers of procurement, approving mass production, and changing operational orders, all amid a global war that tolerated no delays. Some leaders were quick to see the strategic advantage. Denying enemy fleets freedom of movement could choke supply lines and force adversaries into costly evasions. But approval was not purely military calculus. Political oversight, industrial capacity, and inter-service rivalry shaped decision-making. Manufacturing had to pivot, factories needed retooling, and supply chains, already strained, were asked to absorb new demands. Admirals argued in war rooms: deploy now and risk friendly fire incidents and diplomatic repercussions, or delay and allow enemy fleets to rebuild momentum. Field commanders faced their own dilemmas: how to incorporate the weapon into convoy protection or offensive mining campaigns, where to deploy first for maximum effect with acceptable risk, training sailors to handle a new threat, to identify its signatures, and to adapt rescue procedures required time at sea and practice that the war clock rarely allowed. The engineer's invention demanded not just approval, but a doctrinal shift. Reconnaissance, intelligence, and patience had to combine with audacity. Institutional friction was inevitable, yet the war's cruelty militated against doctrinal purity when lives and supplies hung in the balance. Hesitation could not endure. Leadership that adapted faster gained leverage in that calculus. The weapons champions found persuasive arguments. If the device could deny ports, strand convoys, and force the enemy into costly countermeasures, the broader strategic payoff outweighed short-term headaches. The question then became operational: how to deploy, where to accept risk, and how to measure success without exposing friendly forces to undue danger. Beyond tactics and bureaucracy lay a quieter, sharper debate. Was it right to invent a weapon that struck without warning? Naval warfare had long accepted certain brutalities: torpedoes, shelling, and unrestricted submarine campaigns. But an instrument that turned seas into hidden killing zones raised thorny ethical questions. Scientists and officers argued in private memos. Some framed the device as a humane advance. If a single weapon could end prolonged convoy losses and reduce prolonged engagements, then fewer men might die overall. Others saw something darker: weapons that removed the combatant's chance to react. Blurred lines between military target and human lives. Merchant sailors, often civilians pressed into service, were particularly vulnerable. Would the principle of distinction, a cornerstone of just war thinking, be eroded if instruments targeted ships without warning, regardless of cargo or passenger status? Legal advisors studied conventions and past precedents. They measured the device against existing norms of maritime warfare. The conclusion was rarely simple. In wartime, moral calculus often tilts toward necessity. Yet necessity is a slippery guide. The engineer, for his part, kept to the laboratory's practicalities: function, reliability, survivability. He recorded test results, refined mechanisms, and avoided public pronouncements in the field. Commanders made the ethical choices on deployment patterns and targeting restrictions. Public perception, when it eventually learned of the weapon, would further complicate matters. Propaganda could cast it as either a triumph of ingenuity, saving countless lives, or as a sinister invention of unseen slaughter. For now, the debate remained largely private, confined to memos, whispered conversations in corridors of power, and the uneasy conscience of men charged with decisions that would shape thousands of lives. These angles, the enemy's disarray, leadership's fraught adoption, and the moral questioning, converge into a single truth: the weapon had become more than a device. It had become a catalyst, forcing strategic, institutional, and ethical change. The next act would test that change in the crucible of combat. First true test of the weapon came in late 1942. In the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic, intelligence had identified a high-value convoy carrying essential supplies to Britain: food, ammunition, and vehicles crucial for sustaining the war effort. Every ship mattered, and the stakes were immense. The device, long confined to laboratories and test bays, was finally ready for operational deployment. Preparations were meticulous. Engineers Naval officers and tactical planners coordinated in secrecy. The weapon, loaded onto specially equipped mine layers, would be released at night. Under cover of fog and darkness, each device was calibrated to drift silently along the convoy's projected path. Using currents and magnetic sensors to detect the hulls of enemy ships, timing was critical. Too early, and it would drift harmlessly away. Too late, and it might miss the target entirely. The entire operation depended on precision, trust in the calculations, and the reliability of a weapon deemed impossible just months before, as the convoy steamed through the designated sector. Escort ships maintained formation, scanning the waves for the usual signs of submarine threat. Nothing appeared unusual. The night was heavy with mist. The sea a rolling expanse of gray. Sailors spoke in hushed tones, unaware that a silent menace had already entered the water around them. The first strike occurred. A merchant ship shuddered violently, its hull splitting with a force that threw crew members from their stations. Alarms blared, but there was no visible torpedo. No submarine emerging from the depths. Chaos erupted on the deck as sailors scrambled to contain flooding, save lives and call for assistance within minutes. Another ship in the convoy was similarly hit. The precision of the attacks left little room for standard evasive maneuvers. The convoy, trained to react to conventional threats, found itself confronting a danger that defied expectation and standard tactics for the German High Command. Reports of the convoy's destruction were perplexing. Surface patrols and submarine sightings showed no activity. Hull damage suggested an external force. Yet nothing matched any known weapon. Panic began to ripple through intelligence circles. Commanders issued frantic orders for increased minesweeping, convoy rerouting, and degaussing of ships to counter what they suspected might be a magnetic threat. Yet the Allies had already introduced a weapon that operated precisely in the window before countermeasures could take effect on the U.S. side. Naval leaders observed the operation with a mixture of exhilaration and tension. Success validated months of painstaking calculation, testing, and secrecy. The engineer's device had worked as intended, silently, efficiently, and devastatingly, for the first time. The impossible had demonstrated its lethal reality. Reports from field commanders noted not only the destruction inflicted, but also the psychological impact. Sailors, accustomed to tracking visible threats, now understood that the ocean itself had become a trap. Convoy operations, once predictable and disciplined, were now haunted by uncertainty. The human element of the climax was equally profound. Survivors described the surreal terror of being struck without warning. Fear spread more effectively than fire. Reshaping behavior at sea, commanders reassessed tactics mid-journey. Experienced sailors hesitated, double-checking procedures, rethinking formation strategies, and adjusting speed and spacing. Lives were lost, but lessons were learned, lessons that would inform every subsequent engagement. Where the weapon was deployed back at the laboratories, the engineer watched reports of the mission unfold with quiet satisfaction. Years of skepticism, failed prototypes, and sleepless nights had culminated in a single, precise moment. The device had achieved operational success. Yet he understood that the first strike was only the beginning. Every subsequent deployment would test reliability, coordination, and adaptation under the unpredictable variables of real combat. The Atlantic, once a theater of conventional naval warfare, had been irrevocably altered. This first operation marked a decisive turning point. The Allies now possessed a weapon that redefined naval engagements, forcing enemies to confront an invisible, omnipresent threat. Operational doctrine, tactical planning, and psychological resilience all had to evolve simultaneously. The engineer's innovation, once doubted and dismissed, had proven that ingenuity could indeed overcome the impossible, and that the seas themselves could be weaponized with precision and devastating effect. By early 1943, the weapon's operational deployment had escalated. Initial tests had confirmed reliability. Field data allowed planners to refine release points, currents, and timing for maximum effect. Entire convoy routes, once considered routine, now faced an unpredictable menace. The psychological weight was as lethal as the device itself. Sailors and commanders came to understand that no formation, no escort, and no standard maneuver could fully guarantee safety. In February 1943, a critical operation was launched in the North Atlantic. A large convoy, designated SC-118, was transporting tanks, ammunition, and rations to Britain, a lifeline for the Allied campaign in Europe. Mine-layer vessels, operating under strict radio silence, deployed the weapons in advance of the convoy's path. Magnetic sensors, carefully calibrated to detect the hulls of ships, ensured that the devices would strike without warning. The ocean, previously a conduit for movement and commerce, had become a deadly arena where physics and human ingenuity dictated outcomes. As the convoy entered the danger zone, the first detonations occurred. Ships were split open from below, their hulls tearing in a manner unfamiliar to any naval veteran. The sequence was both rapid and precise. One ship, then another and another, all struck in the span of hours. Sailors struggled to comprehend the source of the attacks. No torpedo trails, no submarine periscopes, only sudden catastrophic destruction. Rescue operations were frantic, but chaos reigned. Every officer, every lookout, every crewman was forced to confront a new reality. The oceans themselves could betray enemy intelligence. Scrambled to respond. Kriegsmarine analysts initially suspected conventional torpedo attacks, only to realize that familiar signatures were absent. Attempts to locate attackers, aerial reconnaissance, submarine patrols, and minesweeping revealed nothing. Panic, frustration, and confusion spread through command centers. Tactical doctrine, previously centered on countering observable threats, was rendered partially obsolete. Ships were rerouted, schedules altered, and convoys delayed in an attempt to avoid zones already struck. The psychological impact multiplied the physical devastation. Fear and uncertainty became strategic tools, as effective in deterring enemy operations as the weapon itself. On the Allied side, operational reports poured in. Commanders praised the precision and lethality of the devices. Losses of friendly vessels were minimal, a testament to careful planning and strict adherence to protocols. In laboratories and planning rooms, engineers reviewed performance data with satisfaction. Each success confirmed calculations and validated months of painstaking design. The engineer, often unnoticed amid military bureaucracy, saw his invention prove its worth in the harshest of classrooms. War at sea. The cumulative effect on enemy supply chains and naval operations was profound. German and Japanese fleets, long confident in their control of key maritime routes, were forced into caution. Convoys slowed, rerouted, and sometimes postponed entirely. Fuel and resources were consumed in countermeasures, hull degaussing, magnetic shielding, minesweeping patrols, all of which strained logistics already under pressure. What had begun as a single experimental deployment now reshaped operational strategy across multiple theaters. The climax of this campaign did not occur in a single, isolated moment, but as a series of decisive encounters. Each deployment amplified the weapon's impact. Both physical and psychological. Enemy losses mounted, supply lines faltered, and confidence eroded. Sailors spoke in hushed tones of invisible threats. Commanders recalculated risk for every journey. The weapon's presence forced adaptation, innovation, and caution at every level of naval operations. Yet, the human element remained central. Survivors of attacked convoys described an eerie silence before the explosions, a calm that belied imminent destruction. Officers grappled with rapid decision-making, balancing rescue, defense, and pursuit for the Allied command. Victories were not measured merely in tonnage destroyed, but in the strategic paralysis imposed on the enemy. One engineer's ingenuity had transformed the Atlantic into a theater where unseen forces determined outcomes. where the ocean itself had become a participant in warfare by mid-1943. The pattern was undeniable. The impossible had become operational reality. Enemy fleets were forced to respect an invisible, omnipresent threat. Naval strategy, supply lines, and convoy planning had to adapt. The engineers' work, once relegated to sketches and prototypes, had fundamentally altered the rules of naval engagement. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, had become a proving ground for innovation, human determination, and technological precision. What had begun as skepticism and dismissal had culminated in tactical mastery. The weapon, once called impossible, had emerged as a decisive factor in the war at sea, a silent nightmare that reshaped the battlefield, challenged enemy doctrine, and cemented the role of ingenuity in determining the course of history. Immediate aftermath of the weapon's deployment was stark and undeniable. Convoy losses dropped, not because the sea had become safer, but because the Allies now controlled the invisible battlefield beneath the waves. Enemy fleets, caught off guard by the unprecedented weapon, scrambled to adjust tactics. Supply lines that had once seemed reliable were now fragile, vulnerable not just to submarines or surface attacks, but to a silent, unseen threat that could strike anywhere along a shipping route. Reports from naval intelligence documented the psychological and operational impact. German command centers noted that convoys were increasingly hesitant, rerouting along longer, less efficient paths to avoid suspected danger zones. Fuel expenditures rose, and schedules faltered. Every attempt to counter the weapon, degaussing hulls, altering convoy spacing, or deploying minesweepers, only mitigated risk. Partially losses continued, and fear spread among sailors who could no longer rely on the predictability of prior maritime warfare. For the Allies, the device had become a strategic tool. Naval planners used it not only to destroy enemy shipping but also to create a climate of uncertainty, forcing the Axis to commit resources to countermeasures and slowing their operational tempo. Successive deployments demonstrated consistent reliability, with minimal friendly losses. When operational protocols were followed, admirals recognized the broader significance. This single innovation could shift theaters of war without the need for traditional, large-scale engagements on the human level. Survivors' testimonies painted vivid, haunting images of the weapon's effect. Sailors recalled sudden, violent hull breaches, the roar of explosions, and the scramble to lifeboats under freezing Atlantic skies. Entire merchant crews, previously trained for conventional threats, were forced to confront a danger they could neither see nor anticipate. These accounts reinforced the psychological dimension of the weapon. Terror was as potent as physical destruction in Washington. The engineers' work gained formal recognition, though public acknowledgement remained limited for security reasons. Secret briefings with military leadership highlighted the operational success, emphasizing not only the technical ingenuity, but also the potential for broader strategic deployment. The engineer, largely a figure of private dedication, became a quiet symbol of how innovation could overcome entrenched skepticism. Colleagues, once doubtful, now celebrated the precision and reliability of his creation, acknowledging that months of meticulous experimentation had saved lives and altered naval strategy. Production ramped up, factories were retooled to meet growing demand, and crews were trained in handling, deployment, and maintenance. Every successful mission reinforced the doctrine that the oceans were no longer merely a medium for movement. They had become a theater for precise, invisible warfare. Convoys began to operate with a combination of traditional tactics and new protocols, designed to maximize the weapon's effectiveness while minimizing risk to Allied personnel. Yet the aftermath was not limited to immediate operational gains. The success of the weapon catalyzed changes in Allied naval strategy. Task forces were reorganized to prioritize routes where the device could be most effective. Intelligence operations shifted focus to predict enemy countermeasures, while engineering units prepared for iterative improvements based on field data. The Atlantic had been transformed from a predictable supply line into a complex arena where innovation, calculation, and human ingenuity determined outcomes as the first deployments proved decisive. Both the strategic and psychological implications became clear. The Allies could now shape enemy behavior without direct confrontation. Supply lines faltered. Morale wavered, and the enemy's confidence in their own naval dominance eroded. The engineers' creation, once dismissed as impossible, had shifted the balance in subtle yet decisive ways. This operational and strategic shift set the stage for further analysis of long-term consequences, changes in naval doctrine, technological innovation, and the moral dimensions of warfare. The story of victory, loss, and adaptation would continue beyond individual battles, influencing the broader course of the war. By mid-1943, the long-term effects of the weapon were becoming evident across the Atlantic theater. Supply chains that had once been relatively secure were now tenuous. Forced to adapt to the invisible menace lurking beneath the waves, convoys were rerouted along longer, less efficient paths, consuming more fuel and time. The Allies had achieved a strategic advantage, not only through destruction of enemy vessels, but also by imposing operational paralysis on Axis naval planners. Entire fleets were diverted, redeployed, and sometimes immobilized as commanders struggled to anticipate where the next strike might occur. Technological innovation accelerated. The weapon's success inspired further research into naval engineering, magnetic sensors, and automated detonation systems. Allied labs, building on the engineers' initial breakthroughs, refined designs to increase reliability, enhance safety for friendly vessels, and extend operational range. Concurrently, enemy forces scrambled to develop countermeasures, degaussing hulls, deploying sweepers, and experimenting with magnetic detection. Each adaptation consumed precious resources and time. Compounding the strategic impact, operational doctrine evolved alongside technology. Naval command began to integrate the weapon into larger campaigns, using it to influence enemy behavior rather than merely destroy ships. Convoys were protected by a combination of conventional escorts, aerial reconnaissance, and strategically placed deployments of the device. This integration marked a shift in thinking. Warfare was no longer solely about firepower or numbers. Control of perception and anticipation had become equally vital. The Atlantic, once a predictable corridor of commerce and conflict, had become a domain where innovation dictated the terms of engagement. Human consequences, both immediate and psychological, persisted. Survivors of affected convoys recounted the disorienting terror of sudden attacks. Sailors adapted their training to include precautions for invisible threats, learning to read subtle indicators of danger in the ocean's behavior, and their own instrumentation commanders adjusted tactics, enforcing new spacing protocols and developing contingency plans. The emotional imprint of the weapon extended beyond physical damage. It reshaped confidence, caution, and resilience across Allied and enemy crews alike. The engineer, whose quiet work had catalyzed these changes, remained largely anonymous to the public, but became a symbol of ingenuity within military circles. Reports and memos circulated, praising the effectiveness and precision of the invention, emphasizing the value of persistent experimentation under constraints of skepticism, secrecy, and wartime urgency. His achievement demonstrated how individual brilliance, combined with rigorous scientific method, could alter strategic outcomes on a scale previously thought unattainable. By late 1943, historians and military analysts would later note that the weapon had contributed to the shifting balance of power in the Atlantic. Losses of enemy shipping decreased overall Allied vulnerability, while the psychological and operational strain imposed on Axis planners slowed their capacity to wage effective submarine warfare. The Atlantic campaign, long dominated by stealthy predators and brute force encounters, had been fundamentally transformed. The weapon, once deemed impossible, had become a decisive instrument in reshaping naval strategy. Yet the aftermath also raised enduring questions. About the ethics and scope of technological warfare, the device's silent efficiency highlighted the human cost of innovation. Crews were struck without warning, and the moral boundaries of engagement were tested. Military doctrine adapted, but the tension between necessity and ethical responsibility remained, a reminder that every advance in wartime technology carried both strategic gain and human consequence. In retrospect, the weapon's deployment illustrates a convergence of science, leadership, and human determination. It reshaped oceans, altered enemy calculations, and forced both sides to confront new realities of warfare, from clandestine laboratories to storm-tossed convoys. The consequences of one engineer's work rippled across theaters of war, leaving an indelible mark on strategy, technology, and the human experience of combat. The story now moves toward reflection, a calm, philosophical closure that will examine the broader implications of ingenuity, morality, and the legacy of a weapon once thought impossible. War often elevates ingenuity, testing the limits of human creativity under pressure. The story of this weapon, born in a quiet U.S. laboratory, refined through repeated failure, and unleashed across the Atlantic, illustrates the profound intersection of intellect, necessity, and courage. One engineer, working far from the front lines, reshaped the oceanic battlefield, proving that a single idea, executed with precision and perseverance, could alter the course of history. Yet the legacy extends beyond strategy and destruction. It highlights the duality of innovation in war. The same invention that saved countless Allied lives also brought invisible terror to sailors unprepared for its sudden, devastating power. Ethical questions linger, reminding us that technological breakthroughs carry consequences that ripple through human lives, challenging notions of fairness and responsibility in the crucible of conflict. Strategically, the weapon changed the Atlantic campaign and naval warfare itself. It forced enemy fleets into uncertainty, disrupted supply chains, and reshaped tactics. It demonstrated that control over perception, the unseen threat, can be as decisive as overwhelming firepower. For the Allies, it provided not just tactical advantage, but a psychological edge, transforming fear and doubt into instruments of strategy. The human story, however, remains at the center. The engineer's obsession, sleepless nights, and meticulous experimentation reveal the quiet heroism that often underpins wartime innovation. It is a reminder that behind every transformative weapon lies the persistence, vision, and determination of individuals who refuse to accept impossible as an answer. Ultimately, the narrative reflects on how warfare is not solely a contest of armies or machines, but of minds. It is in these unseen calculations, precise inventions, and relentless refinement that history pivots. The Atlantic, once a theater dominated by brute force and predictable threats, became a testament to human ingenuity, and in that transformation lies a deeper truth. Even in the darkest hours of war, intelligence, persistence, and daring imagination can leave a mark far greater than any single battle, a legacy that echoes across time, reminding us of both the power and the responsibility inherent in invention.